Good afternoon. My name is Nick Rampone, and I will be walking this group through how we can best secure the typical SDLC for the business and future software products we develop. There's a lot to cover in a short amount of time, so I'll be brief as possible. Additional information can be found in the documentation, which has been emailed to all of you, and I'm available to answer any questions you may have via email or scheduled meeting. So we'll start by taking a look at the existing Agile process and basic SDLC. The Agile process was created out of necessity to expedite the timeline of its predecessor, waterfall development. With Agile development, projects can move through faster development iterations and the continuous integration, continuous deployment pipeline, so that businesses can provide tangible products faster and incrementally test and improve them prior to deployment. The Agile process has, on average, 7 phases, which are requirements, analysis, design, development, testing, deployment, and maintenance. We see those phases here in the cyclical and flowchart format. When looking at the flowchart, the phases are divided into 4 buckets: business development, quality assurance, and operations. And we're going to refer back to these buckets throughout the presentation. The problem with the SDLC is that it's now a bit outdated. It does not acknowledge the growing security concern of the software industry. As the web and the public's reliance on web applications grow, so too do the adversaries who are looking to exploit software for personal gains. It is our job to defend against these attacks, and the best way we can do this is by securing the SDLC and therefore the software we develop. So in the current SDLC, security is often not addressed until the testing phase and the maintenance phase. At this late stage in the process, it is often costly, time-consuming, and unreasonable to make changes for security. The thought process has been we can add that in a future patch, and this gives birth to bolt-on security. So to look at some numbers and understand from a business perspective why we need to secure the SDLC, bolt-on security has a major pitfall, and that is that hackers are more likely to exploit the vulnerabilities which were left as an accepted risk in the final product before we can safely and securely patch them. In 2023, IBM ran their annual data breach report and found the cost of a cyber attack is on average 4.45 million. Personally, I think that's probably a little low. So multiple studies from Ponemon Institute and IBM, which we'll see on the next slide, have found that the cost of repairing software bugs increases exponentially as development pushes further through the SDLC. This is no surprise since we all know that making changes after coding has commenced is time-consuming and costly, not to mention aggravating to developers. So, for example, if a team realized after the implementation phase that coding with the C language leaves the product vulnerable to buffer overflow and memory leaks, and they decide they wanted to switch to Rust, it would likely not be possible at that point, since the source code had already been written, or it would be a very heavy lift. Now, if the same team makes the same realization during the requirements, analysis, or design phase, the switch will be effortless and the software will be more secure. These are more slides from the studies I mentioned that show the exponential increase in cost to repair flaws as the process progresses. So how do organizations make important security decisions earlier in the SDLC process? They follow the movement and they shift left. They test earlier, they test more often, and they identify any flaws before they become too expensive or time consuming to mitigate. Now you may say, how do we test without having at least an alpha product? The answer is simple. Testing doesn't only mean running the application and looking for bugs. Testing includes applying trusted methodologies, can be abstract thought exercises, or tabletop paper tests, which we'll get into shortly. The idea is not to just shift left, but also to spread testing across the SDLC rather than lumped up in the final phase. So I want to introduce the OWASP SAM methodology as the security framework that I am recommending for the company to use to secure the existing SDLC. It's trusted, it's tried, it's proven to be effective, and it incorporates many cybersecurity tactics which have been effective at reducing vulnerabilities and the attack surface. So think of SAM, or really any security framework, as the new password complexity requirement. You wouldn't let a user use password as a password. So why would you let the business use an SDLC without a security framework? There needs to be some requirements for meeting security standards or expectations. Throughout this presentation, we will tie back and suggest security activities which link to the SAM methodology for securing the SDLC. Again, there's a link in the accompanying documentation. Anyone interested in looking more into SAM can use it. But ultimately, we are applying the SAM framework to the existing basic SDLC to safeguard against the OWASP top 10 and other threats. So when we apply the SAM framework to the existing basic SDLC flowchart, we derive a new flowchart, a secure SDLC. Some folks call this STAC SDLC or SSDLC. The bottom line is this bolsters the 7 phases of the agile process with a few supplemental security-specific tactics. The SSDLC flowchart highlights the 11 security steps which are suggested to be added, as well as one for privacy. And they are listed here on the left and in the documentation. So now we begin to enter the world of DevSecOps or SecDevOps. A few years back, it was decided that development and operations must no longer be siloed, and so DevOps was born. However, this still left security out of the conversation. And when we speak of DevSecOps, many fear that the agile process will be too lengthy with security added and therefore no longer agile. However, we must remember the cost in time and money that the business will incur as a result of poor security planning. Planning upfront with a slightly longer iteration period will reduce downtime and financial impacts in the future. DevSecOps and the SSDLC do not set out to add to the agile process. Instead, the goal is to intertwine security with the process. So getting into those buckets we spoke of earlier, the first bucket will be one that didn't exist in the basic SDLC, and that is what I call the cultural bucket. So with SecDevOps and the idea of shifting left security, we must first examine the culture of the business and evaluate where security ranks as a priority to the team, starting with staffing numbers. So this slide shows a ratio of 1 cybersecurity subject matter expert to every 10 system architects to every 100 devs to every 1,000 employees. And this is a common ratio according to the LinkedIn and Guardrails IO websites. So looking at this, it is unreasonable to imagine that a business could ever reach a ratio of 1 to 1 or even 1 to 10. Cyber is that little purple square in the bottom right. So while it may be difficult to onboard the desired number of cyber SMEs, it is possible to expand the cyber mentality within the existing team of developers, engineers, and operations personnel. So we're focusing specifically on training for the IT column on the right, not everyone else in the blue. So rather than trying to hire cyber SMEs, the business can train the existing devs and architects. A set of program that warns of suspicious emails and malicious links is great for everyone else over in the blue. But when it comes to building security, the IT team can and should go a little more in depth. So instilling a security-focused mindset within the IT team will bring security to the forefront and make it a priority of the developers and architects rather than just the few cyber professionals in the company. Training the IT team on security best practices, things like secure coding guidelines, automated testing tools, this is going to shift left, far left in the SDLC security by making it everyone's priority and focus. So speaking of secure coding guidelines and training, the organization must create and enforce secure coding guidelines for the developers. It is not the responsibility of the devs to code securely. We wish they would, but it's up to the business to set that benchmark. This is not a heavy lift. There are many groups who have already worked out how to code securely in general and for various specific languages. The idea is straightforward. There are ways to code that will reduce attack vectors. Again, we refer to WASP, which has provided this checklist for securing coding practices. And I'll leave this here for just a second. Again, it's in the documentation. So one final piece about culture, which is not part of the SSDLC flowchart, is vendor management. Similar to secure coding, it is the responsibility of the business to vet out the vendors and set the bar for acceptable security standards. We can't work with just anyone or use any dependency, especially if it will introduce vulnerabilities. There could be a whole presentation on this slide, but it boils down to we need to hold our vendors, third parties, APIs, and dependencies to the same level of security standards as we hold ourselves. If they get hacked, we probably will too. This brings us to the business bucket. It contains the first phase, which is the requirements phase. So with the secure SDLC, we have to expand the requirements checklist beyond just business and compliance requirements. We have to include security and privacy requirements as well. Business requirements only identify things like user groups, platforms, features, functionality, and compliance requirements are set by regulatory bodies like HIPAA, NYDFS, GDPR, CCPR, SOX, etc. The business needs to set the expectation for security from the onset of the project. This is the first step in addressing security, and it is the foundation on which all other security steps will be built. If we miss this, we will fail at providing a secure product. This list displayed here includes a handful of the security requirements which should be addressed during the requirements phase of the SSDLC. So again, the documentation goes much deeper, but I will quickly say that there are secure functional requirements, access control, authenticate, authorize, audit, data protection. There are functional security requirements, things like session management, input validation, compliance requirements. There's non-functional security requirements, so performance, usability, privacy, legal compliance. And then there are secure development requirements. So your secure coding guidelines, dependency management, training and awareness. The diagram here shows factors that make up security requirements and how they impact the security architecture of the project. One quick note, compliance is not security. Compliance is a requirement. Security is a choice. Security builds on compliance to exceed the standards. This is another reason why security requirements must exist in addition to business and compliance requirements. So the development bucket, this encompasses the analysis, design, and implementation phase. So there's a lot in this bucket. Again, we're not going to dive too deeply into threat modeling. It could be a whole nother presentation, but we are going to say that the SSDLC must include threat modeling. There are many types to choose from. We just need to choose one that works for the company and for the product we are developing. Threat modeling is a cyclical task, and it begins with defining the security requirements, which we just did, diagramming the system on paper, identifying possible attack vectors, mitigating those risks, and validating that the suggested changes satisfy the mitigation efforts before finally starting again when a new sprint or iteration begins. So no matter which type of threat modeling we select, there's many listed here on the left. There's even more. Data flow diagrams and attack trees will be an important piece. These are visual aids that allow members from all teams to see a high-level picture of the design and pinpoint attack vectors based on the flow of data through a system and the interactions between objects, users, and databases. So there on the right, you see a data flow diagram example at the top and a attack tree example on the bottom. Within the development bucket, after the design phase, but before implementation, we introduced the security architecture design review step. This step is a check and sign off that, yes, we have used the security architecture to design the software thus far, and we are ready to begin implementation. A security architecture review must be collaborative so that members from all teams, not just cyber, can weigh in on security concerns. Like threat modeling, there are various types of security architecture to choose from, again, in the documentation, and the business can select one or create a hybrid, whichever works best. The important thing is that a security architecture is selected and the design review is structured, strategic, and collaborative. The architecture review should also confirm that the security architecture focuses on security by design, it's policy-driven, risk-aware, and has outlined testing procedures. Static application security testing, or SAST, it's one of the first tools we're going to introduce. It's an automating testing tool which is applied to source code during implementation. It's used to identify known coding vulnerabilities and is going to expedite the process of human secure code review. It can be run nightly or after any code change, and it quickly identifies the low-hanging fruit or silly mistakes, which could become large flaws after implementation. So SAST allows teams to quickly mitigate obvious code-based vulnerabilities. It is a white box early development phase vulnerability scan, and it should be used early in the CI/CD pipeline. So moving into the QA bucket, which focuses on testing. The first tool in the testing phase is dynamic application security testing, or DAST. So it's similar to SAST in that it is an automated tool used to scan software for vulnerabilities, and it's very useful for expediting the CI/CD pipeline again. However, it differs because it runs on the running application rather than on source code. So at this stage in the testing phase, the product is developed. It's being examined for quality assurance. We've applied secure coding guidelines, threat modeling, security architecture design review, and SAST to weed out the obvious flaws. Now we use DAST to automate and replicate a hacker attempting to break into the running application. This tool will find less obvious flaws in our application and is the first step in what's considered the secure SDLC testing phase. So DAST is a black box test since it simulates attacks on running software. And the chart here highlights the differences between SAST and DAST. So important to note, DAST is a testing phase security tactic. SAST is a design phase tool. DAST will find live environmental flaws. SAST won't. So after we start using DAST, we move into types of requirement testing, as Sam refers to these activities. So these ensure that the implemented security controls operate as expected and satisfy the project's stated security requirements from the beginning of the process. So fuzzing involves feeding an application a large amount of random or unexpected input data to discover vulnerabilities, errors, or unexpected behavior. The goal of fuzzing is to expose flaws which would only be triggered by mutated expected input, right? Injection flaws are the big one here. Abuse case testing is a software testing approach that focuses on identifying and mitigating potential misuse or abuse of the system. So unlike traditional testing that often concentrates on validating expected functionality, abuse case testing is a negative testing, and it's designed to explore scenarios where attackers intentionally misuse the system to identify vulnerabilities and weakness. This involves thinking from an attacker's perspective and considering scenarios where the system could be intentionally exploited. Denial of service, DOS, stress testing, sometimes just called stress testing, is a cybersecurity testing technique aimed at assessing the resilience and performance of the system under heavier extreme loads. So while stress testing in general focuses on evaluating the system's ability to handle high traffic, the term DOS stress testing specifically emphasizes on testing the system's capacity to withstand a deliberate attempt to overwhelm it. It mimics a DOS attack or a DDoS attack. Manual penetration testing should be the final stage of testing before the deployment phase. At this point in the SSDLC, the remaining vulnerabilities should be few and or known and accepted. The purpose of pen testing is to identify the remaining unknown flaws and confirm that remaining known vulnerabilities are accepted, have a low impact, and they've been tested for their complexity. Also well documented for future patching. So when I say tested for complexity, I'm speaking about the fact that a large portion of hackers are script kiddies or slightly better will not have the skill or patience to attempt to crack a complex flaw. Skilled hackers will do so if they see an opening and a value for their time and the risk they're taking. So when discussing pen testing, there are three main types: white, gray, and black box. The obvious and dangerous arrow here is not to say that white box flaws identified pose a high likelihood of being exploited. It's to say that white box teams are expected to find such flaws since they have access to source code, security architecture designs, network topologies, etc. Black box testing, on the other hand, is often conducted by an outside consultant who specializes in pen testing. This team will have permission, they'll have the skill and the time to attempt to exploit remaining vulnerabilities using only resources a malicious attacker would have. So by the time black box testing is being conducted, the system should be so secure that even this skilled group of ethical hackers has trouble finding an attack vector. So the last bucket is operations. It contains the deploy and maintenance phases. Only after completing the SSDLC and its security-centric tasks is it safe to enter the deployment phase. The software can be considered to have a respectable level of security if the organization has followed the outlined steps. Remaining vulnerabilities should be few, complex, low impact, and well documented. After the deployment phase comes the maintenance phase. Security incident and event management program and the matching incident response program must be established to continue the cycle of security. So while CM can manually and will always require human dissemination, there are tools available to automate the task. CM focuses on monitoring and running applications live in use by the end users and the general public to detect malicious activity. So as part of the SSDLC, CM programs should not only prevent an intrusion, but it should also be used to identify any unknown risks, which the SSDLC security steps were unable to identify. Essentially, we want to use CM to ideally stop the bad guys, but also see how they break in if they do so we can stop them from doing it again in the future. Regular penetration testing. In addition to CM, during the maintenance phase, regular penetration testing should be conducted at least annually, and in some cases must be done for compliance. First and foremost, it is security-wise to continuously be scanning the software for security issues at every stage. With the product live and the agile process on repeat, it's no longer appropriate to only conduct pen tests at a specific phase. It should be done constantly. White and black box testing should be continuously in use. to not only quickly identify new or existing flaws, but also to test the effectiveness of the SAM program. Again, compliance does not guarantee security, though it is foundational and it is required. So from a regulatory perspective, there are prescriptive and descriptive frameworks. The list here touches on some of the more common regulations, which either prescribe or describe the need for regular penetration testing. Again, documentation dives deeper. In closing, the basic SDLC has become slightly antiquated given the value of the data within the systems and the risk posed by skilled malicious hackers to both the business and the end users. The secure SDLC does slightly lengthen the agile process by including security considerations from the onset of the project, but it greatly reduces the possible impact to the organization, the client, and the end users. The suggested SSDLC introduces 11 security tactics, practices, and methodologies for hardening our software against would-be attackers. So here we see the tactics suggested, the secure SSDLC flowchart, and a modernized agile process, which has a security overlay. And just a bonus slide. These are the levels of maturity achieved for the OWASP SAM framework if the proposed SSDLC is applied. We end up reaching level 1 or higher on 12 SAM areas of assurance. Thank you very much.